Good morning, everyone. We are in the very last steps of this beautiful discipleship vow. I very much enjoyed teaching it, so sharing it with you. So I'm kind of sorry to see it end, and so I'm milking every word to the end here. We'll see if this is our last class or our penultimate. We'll decide afterwards. All right, let's pray together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swamiji, we open our hearts and minds to your transforming presence. Every day we do our best to live in harmony with your divine light. Our success and our failure alternate day by day. Only by your grace, by your entering into our hearts, are we able to rise above the alternating waves of our own ego desires. We are deeply sincere in our aspirations, and we have absolute faith that your presence in our lives will draw us into the light. Help us to move quickly, steadily, calmly, joyously, ever closer to your presence. Fulfill in us all the longings of our heart by filling us with your love alone. Om. Peace. Amen. Well, we're in this last section, and I've dealt with most of the lines in it, but I'll read it from the top. Discipline me, guide me, purify me. Teach me to attune myself to thy ray, until at last, through daily meditation, service, and devotion, I unite my soul with thy infinite spirit. That's the last line of the vow. I unite my soul with thy infinite spirit. So, yesterday we talked about teach me to attune myself to thy ray, comma, until at last, comma, through daily meditation, service, and devotion. Swami wrote to me once be strong in devotion, service, and meditation, and everything else will follow in relatively short order. I think I referred to that yesterday because I'm so conscious of how exactly Swami uses his words. I think I was speaking of this last night because I was going through his book, In Divine Friendship, Letters of Swami Kriyananda. I'm teaching a class on Tuesdays. I highly recommend the book and also recommend the class because we've been learning a lot going through it. And so when I'm working with this one, I often comment about how extremely exact Swamiji is in his speech, which is to say he's very truthful, is what he is. Exactness in speech is just being truthful, and truthful being loyal to a higher truth and not merely the facts of a situation, because sometimes the facts actually are downward pulling of the energy and therefore are less true than a way of expressing things that keeps the energy moving toward the light, because truth is that we're all moving toward the light. The facts sometimes make that somewhat discouraging, but truth is that we're moving toward it. So when Swami said to me, everything else will follow in relatively short order, I think he wrote that to me in the early 70s. Somewhere I probably have the notes still. But I always thought relatively short order, short, relative. It's just like, it was such a beautifully open-ended way of telling me to persevere. And if I persevered, everything would come out all right. He was also telling me, which I very much needed at that time, to relax, to exhale, that this was not a sprint. This was a very long distance run, and I just needed to keep at it. So he says, you'll discipline, you'll guide me, you'll purify me, you'll teach me how to be attuned. And the end of that story is, at last, I will unite my soul with thy infinite spirit, meaning that the story isn't over until we've reached that point. That's a that's such a that's such a simple idea, but it's an idea that has so much power, which is there is no possibility that we will finish anywhere but uniting our soul with the infinite spirit. So wherever we are in that process, we're simply on the way to it. There's no absolute ending point except in absolute bliss. And what happens to us simply is that we get to have more days of limited consciousness. That's really all that happens to us. We get to be limited. We get to experience the delusion of limitation for a little bit longer. But then he says, until at last, and then he says, by daily meditation, service, and devotion. And this is the trio that characterizes our particular spiritual path. Um, devotion is, well, devotion is a very interesting word. We tend to think of devotion as loving God and as all the different ways that we express that feeling aspect of the spiritual path through chanting, through prayer, through the intimacy of our conversations with God, the company that we keep. And all of that is true. Those are the practices of devotion. But one thing I also love about the word devotion is that it comes from devoted, devoted to. And if we just stand back for a moment and separate it from the spiritual context, devoted to is a definition of what's important to us. So, what am I devoted to? I was thinking about all of this in my own life because my my progress my progress is the progress of what I mean. I don't know exactly how to characterize this, but I think I'm an archetype, and an archetype of a creative artist is not really that I'm an artist. It's just that I'm a person whose energy comes in creative bursts. When I first started writing um, books, of which I now, oddly enough, have published 4, which amazes me. The first 3 of them, and actually every book you write, this is true of every book you write, but it took me a while to understand. The first 3 are episodic, which is each chapter stands completely alone. It has no relationship to anything that came before or came after. And the first book that I wrote, I was trying to write a continuous narrative, I was trying to write the book that eventually became Lightbearer, which is a continuous narrative, although it's also episodic because I did it year by year. But the concept that the book had to be continuous from front to back just absolutely overwhelmed me because I can concentrate deeply in short bursts. So I wrote, when I finally wrote, which was my first book, they were individual stories. Each one stood completely alone. And the process I used for writing it was that I concentrated on one story. I finished it completely. It was absolutely word perfect as far as I could make it. I put it away, and I actually never went back, or very little went back and edited again. It was just finished. But if you're episodic like that in your spiritual life, which I am because I am in my life, it's not a straight line. It's a kind of zigzag all over the place. There's a wonderful, there's an absolutely wonderful little short animated video called the romance between a dot and a line. You can look it up. I had seen it first as a book, but now, of course, it's an animated something or another. It's decades old, and it's something like a romance of simple mathematics, and it's a dot and a line, and how the dot is really more impressed with the squiggle than she is with the straight line. And then the straight line learns to express itself in all kinds of very impressive ways, and the dot becomes completely enamored of him. So whenever I see that line just sort of jumping out in all directions, I think, that's what it is to be me. And even if you can't give this whole big story like I'm talking about your temperament, the spiritual path is not a straight line. It's just a squiggle all over the place. But devotion is not just how much you chant, it's what you're devoted to. And very steadily, I might actually say, I'll just randomly say it now, that I think the single most important development of my life over all the decades that I've been on the spiritual path is I've gained greater and greater confidence in the fact that I am absolutely devoted to divine wisdom, and I am absolutely devoted to following this path until it lasts. And that may not sound like very much, but it's actually everything. Because the basis of so much insecurity is just not really knowing oneself well enough to know what one's true values are. This is what real introspection is. Real introspection is to understand what my bottom line values are. I was interested just in watching my thought process. I think it may have been the first time I traveled to India completely alone. I traveled in a pilgrimage group, I traveled with friends, and then at some point when Swami was already in India, it's not that I would have gone to India to be by myself, but we had many friends in India at that point, so I could make the 24-hour plane flight alone, and then when I got to the country, I would be taken care of. I'm a very experienced traveler, but not a very good one. I've always had people, in place to take care of me, so I'm actually quite helpless in remarkable ways, but I managed to get away with it, so I'm just going to keep going that way. But it was my first travel alone. I traveled through South Korea. You've heard me say this before, but it's completely relevant. I traveled through South Korea. I was at the Seoul airport, which was really actually a very, very pleasant airport with an excellent vegetarian restaurant somewhere. And I was there about 3 or 4 hours completely alone. A country I'd never been to, I knew nothing about. I was only in the airport, of course. I had no idea what the language was. I couldn't read the script. I mean, nothing. Complete foreign land from the point of view of the culture, not understanding. And the thought crossed my mind because Swami always talked about cataclysmic events that would change the nature of the planet. And so it's always a tape in the back of my mind, whether this is the moment for the cataclysmic event. What if something happened and I could never get out of South Korea? And I actually, because one of the ways I deal with my anxieties is I project out what could possibly happen. What's the very worst that could possibly happen? I see myself walking through it and realize, well, if it does happen, this is what I'll do and it'll be fine. A nurse friend of mine, Miriam, who used to take care of Swamiji in the last years of his life, who took care of Swami in the last years of his life, she'd always been an ICU nurse and worked with critical care. And she would often rehearse, the life-threatening catastrophe so that when it did happen, which in her life it actually did happen, she would know, she would be able to just walk through it because she had. So I was walking through it. So here I am in Seoul, Korea. The biggest problem is I don't know the language. I can't read. I can't talk. So I'm going to have to get some manual labor job, probably cleaning hotel rooms, because that's a job you can do whether you can speak the language or not. My first thing would be I'd have to study the language. I'd have to learn the language. And when I finally managed to learn enough Korean to be able to communicate, I'd open an Ananda Center. And it was really interesting to me that I would just do what I had to do to get back to the point where I could begin to serve Master again. And it's hard for me to explain how restful that was in my heart, because it told me that this isn't something that I put on so that other people can see it. This is who I'm supposed to be. But underneath, I really am like this, and I want this, and I don't do this. I was talking to someone recently who was in a position where he himself had decided that in this position, this is the person he had to be. And he was always working with this disconnect between who he felt he was and who he felt he ought to be. And these are the kind of tensions, these are the kind of vrittis, whether we're aware of them or not, these are the kind of vrittis that make it very difficult for us to unite our souls with God. Because we're clinging to these limitations and we're vibrating with self-concern and filling a lot of space with self-concern. And it's either our divine self or our limited self, one or the other. They can't, they can They can share the path, but you can't be entirely one or the other. But to just realize if the worst happened and I was completely alone, no one was watching, there was absolutely nothing, I could do anything at all. I really felt quite sincerely, as soon as I could, I would get back to sharing Master's teachings. Oh, this is who I really am. This is what I'm devoted to. And so I started with that word devotion, but this is what Swami means. Of course, he also means love God, because until we bring that feeling aspect into things, and it's not a matter of personality. This is one of the wonderful stories that people tell about Sri Yukteswar, who was Master. And Master himself said that his way of relating was the language of love. Master, he loved Divine Mother. He was devotional in his temperament, and Sri Yukteswar, by contrast, followed the path of cold mathematical wisdom. He wasn't extravagant in the expression of his feelings. And in Autobiography of a Yogi, Master talks about going back to see Sri Yukteswar in 1935 and forcing his guru to say, "I love you," to him. He said, not since the day they met has he said that. And Sri Yukteswar resisted his disciples' entreaty, and then only very slowly was willing to speak. And then he spoke beautifully. I never had a son, but I always wanted to be able to pass on to someone everything that is of value to me. I'm paraphrasing. And you are that son. I mean, and yes, of course, I love you as my own. But that was like only the second time in all their lifetime together that Sri Yukteswar would bring those words out, where a person of devotional temperament would easily and happily say it every day. But then Sri Yukteswar writes, I believe it's the book, The Holy Science, it must be that one, but he talks, all the way through about all these philosophical concepts, and at the end concludes that the only way to make spiritual progress on the spiritual path is through love. Because ultimately, when the feeling aspect, we are feeling chitta. That is the fundamental nature of consciousness. When we say the fundamental nature of consciousness is feeling, means it's an experience of bliss. And bliss is a feeling. Bliss is not an abstraction. It's not like we have this theoretical idea that all is light, that all is love, that all is joy. We feel that all is light, all is love, all is joy. And it's when we feel that our relationship to the world begins to shift completely. And that's why daily meditation and service have to be in there to support that. Because otherwise then it becomes an abstraction again. Or it's an idea, or it's an ungrounded idea that we can have that feeling, but it won't necessarily lead to our uniting our soul with the infinite spirit, because it will go every which way. I mean, it happens very often. We made an effort in our community with moderate success, because it's very hard to, one, it's impossible to control the feelings of the heart, and number two, in a community with the spirit of Ananda guided by Swamiji, we simply don't dictate people's personal lives. It's just people have to self-direct. But we've made an effort at various times, because in an effort to help people only, when you first come to the community, when you're first involved with it, not the community, I'm talking strictly about Ananda Village, which is a forest ashram. And when you move into that forest ashram, you were really severing, just because of the geography. Less so now because of the internet, but just because of the geography, you have separated yourself to a very large extent from whatever your life was before. When you live in an urban community, like we do in Palo Alto, in Portland, Seattle, to an extent in Los Angeles, you can continue with many of the other realities that you had, and you just reside in the community. But as soon as you walk off the property, you're in the world as it always is. Ananda Village is very remote. You can live. You don't really ever have to leave. You can do everything that you want. Everything that you need in your life is right there. So when you move there and you go into the year-long training course and so on, you're really making a total shift. And uh, it's wonderful. If you have the karma to be able to do that, and if you have the karmic inclination to live that way, highly recommend it. It was my first 16 years of spiritual life, and it's a great story. I'm a missionary by temperament, which means that I need to be in a place where I can serve in the way that I serve. Um, but as a lifestyle, it's fantastically good. So we made an attempt, because what would happen, and this is where I'm going with feeling, people would come into that atmosphere and they would be meditating together and they would be chanting and they'd be living in this 100% spiritual environment with their spiritual family, and your heart just opens like you've never seen before. When I was living there my first 6 months, I moved from San Francisco to Ananda Village in 1971 when it was very primitive there. I did not realize until I got there that I had spent most of my life behind a protective shield, because the world that I was living in was very uncongenial to my inner spirit. And so even without thinking about it, I just would always keep a little bit of a shield between me and the world around me, between me and my environment. So I'm living then at the seclusion retreat, which is just perfectly isolated. My work is cooking for my beloved family. I did have to drive into Nevada City, but only to buy groceries and do laundry. And Nevada City was just a little rural town at that point. Um, but I realized I could open my heart in a way that I didn't know that I wasn't doing. So one feels all these feelings and one opens one's heart, and then one begins to think that the love is actually coming from him or her, the attractive him or her who's close to you. So we saw that people were getting themselves involved in unfortunate relationships because they couldn't tell where the joy was coming from. So we made an effort to try to have people not get involved in intimate relationships during their first year. And depending on who's enforcing the policy, it was more or less successful. But that was an example of, you feel this great onrush of energy, but if it's not grounded in meditation and service, it won't necessarily lead to you uniting your soul with God. You'll be uniting your soul in lots of different ways, but not necessarily in the way that you're really devoted to doing. So meditation, of course, brings us back on a daily basis, and it's very important that we meditate daily, because it doesn't take much for the mind and the heart to begin to spin, especially everybody in the world. Well, everybody in the world longs for a great deal. We long for intimacy with other people. We long for recognition, for respect, for self-confidence, for countless things. And our habit is to look outside ourselves for those realities. And again, especially when you're starting on the spiritual path, and this is a vow when you're just beginning as a disciple, it's so habitual to us. All of these habits of looking outside ourselves are so habitual and so natural from anybody's point of view, except one who is trying to realize God, that we don't even know we're doing it. The realization that I had at the village, well, it wasn't the village then, but when I was first living up at what is now Ananda Village, the degree to which I had been protecting myself my entire life, it was shocking to me, because it had never occurred to me that I was even doing it. What to speak of, was it desirable? How would I dismantle it? And this is one of the reasons why Master says environment is stronger than willpower, because we're always responding to the environment around us, either with longing or rejection or whatever it might be. And so when we wall ourselves in because the environment is so confusing to us, it's not only that our energy can only come out through that wall, but anything that might be trying to reach us can also only reach us through that wall. But when I was suddenly in an environment where everything was pointing toward God, however, just as what I was saying, what meditation does for us is it rejects the external world, even for a period of time. It rejects it in terms of participating in it. We literally close off our senses, and put ourselves. We cease to use our bodies. We try to stop using our minds, and we close ourselves off from the external world to discover the actual origin point of all that experience, which is not outside ourselves, but within ourselves. And so it's a constant reset. So no matter how far the energy begins to spin, and it can spin pretty far in the course of a day, it can just run into all kinds of fantasies and desires and hopes and expectations and reawakening of samskars, just feeling the sudden rush, especially if you're in the process of developing spiritually. We are literally running energy through the spine if we're meditating in ways that we never have before. And the vrittis, samskars is another word. Samskars are past impressions on your consciousness. Vrittis are the whirlpools of energy that are lodged in the spine, in the chakras. And what happens is, the way I think about it is, all of those vrittis, all of those samskars are like paper clips buried in sand. And when we begin to meditate and we begin to run energy through the spine, all of those um, uh, latent realizations, those latent feelings, those latent desires, um, and running energy through the spine is like running a magnet over the top of the sand. And the more powerful that magnet gets by our effort, those paper clips begin to wiggle their way through the sand. It's a very graphic image. And they wiggle their way upward into greater and greater awareness in our conscious mind, in exact proportion to the power of that magnet moving across them. And so when they come to the surface, ideally, they'll just get swept into the magnetic force and they'll get drawn to the spiritual eye. And they'll get either spiritualized, which is, the right relationship will come to you, the right impulse for self-expression will come to you, the right circumstances will come to you. That's ideal, but often they don't arrive. The proportions are such that the vritti, the samskar, resists. It resists the upward pull. And when we're in the process of meditating every day, and I'll speak about service apparently tomorrow, but when we're in the process of meditating every day, it allows for the smooth development of those. If we're not regular in our meditation practice, if we can't quite make it every day, but if we're not regular in our meditation practice, if we're not constantly increasing that flow of energy, then we activate those latent impulses, but we don't necessarily spiritualize them. And so a lot happens that's sometimes very exciting and interesting, but the until at last I unite my soul begins to expand out, and relatively short order becomes relative to a longer and longer span of time. And the reward for that is really simple. We just get to spend more time in limitation than we do in freedom. We're not damned to hell. Nobody hates us. God doesn't stop loving us. It's just a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I, until at last I unite my soul, how long will that be? Well, it depends how conscientiously we practice daily meditation, service, and devotion. So, my friend, God bless you. We haven't quite finished with this, so we'll go at least one more day discussing this beautiful vow.